Okay, great. Yeah, so I think some of the implications of what Ryu was talking about in his portion of the talk is that technology is everywhere and it's going to change the way that we think, right? So there are two implications of this from my perspective. The first one is understanding what does this mean for us and people or learners, right? So that's the thing on the right here, what happens in the brain, which I think Nastasia has very comprehensively covered. What I'm going to cover is what's on the left, right? So how do we leverage technological ubiquity to improve education? So how do we go from this picture that Ryu used in the 18th century to what we have now, right? So next slide. I think some of the general takeaways from what was discussed by Ryu and Nastasia is that, first of all, human brains go beyond the raw information processing that computers do, right? And this goes back to the discussion between Ryu and Joseph earlier about semiotics, right? So we as human beings are concerned with conceptual understandings or phenomena more so than just withholding information and storing it, right? The other implication is that humans are social animals, right? So from all the studies we see from the fMRI and social media, it's that whether in physical or digital spaces, we are actively interested in our connections with each other, whether that's our immediate peers or wider society. For education, I think what this means is we need to ask ourselves, how do we support better semiotics, right? Better ability to understand concepts and train students to be able to do that. And the other use of technology is, can we capitalize on the human tendency towards sociality to develop, first of all, this first point on developing better conceptual understandings, and second of all, to improve social collaboration to feed back into this process, right? So next slide, please. And there are many people who have thought about this, right? So MOE is included. This graphic is from MOE, right? And they have identified many domains where we can apply e-pedagogy in education. Many of these will be familiar to you and bear no further explanation. So learning together, pretty self-explanatory. Metacognition, personalization, scaffolding, assessment for learning, differentiation, and maybe the one that needs a little bit of elaboration is conceptual change. So how can you represent a concept and a single concept and multiple representations or even multimodal representations, right? There are many technological applications widely used that do these things. There are some that are being actively developed in the present, and some which researchers are trying to develop and startups are trying to develop, which are pushing the envelope of what we do in these spaces, right? And in many of these spaces, we will see, as I go through some examples later on, that we never just tackle one of these alone, right? We always tackle them as a group, and that's often because learning is, it's a cohesive process. We can't say, oh, I do only one thing, and that's how people learn. But how do we look at these different areas and all these things that we can do with technology in a more integrated framework? The things on the right of the table align with some of our objectives, the broad goals of education in Singapore, and unsurprisingly, this is also true for most of the rest of the developed world, right? So developing good conceptual understanding and being able to apply them and transfer them to new contexts is fundamentally human, and it supports our ability to think and apply the knowledge that we know creatively in complex situations, right? So it speaks to this critical and inventive thinking that we are so used to hearing about. If you go to the next slide again. And the other thing is on collaboration, right? So for the interactive aspect, not just feeds into this knowledge creation or conceptual understanding component. It's also a means for us to practice and get better at collaborating with people in a modern society. It's a fundamental skill for anybody who lives in a place where there's at least one other person involved, and probably one of the hardest things that AI will ever be able to replace us in. One way that we think about evidence in the learning sciences towards how people learn is the ICAP framework, right? So the ICAP framework just took all this evidence coming up from learning sciences and it put them together in saying a general framework which says that student learning can be classified into 4 modes of emergent student behavior during the learning activity, right? So they can learn passively, they can learn actively, they can learn constructively, and they can learn interactively. And if you look at it in terms of strongest for learning, interactive, towards the weakest for learning, passive, that's how you get ICAP as the acronym, right? So passive behavior is you just listen, right? So maybe like what some people are doing now is you're just listening and then, oh, okay, or you're watching a lecture, watching a video, and then fine, right? You passively learn. Active learning is some sort of physical engagement. So if you're taking notes, if you're summarizing text, if you are looking at a video like, oh, maybe let's rewind and rewatch it again, that's active learning. Constructive learning means you're actually generating an output that wasn't in the learning material itself, right? So if you're explaining something, so you're doing a self-explanation, someone explained it to you, now you make it your own and you explain, or you draw a diagram like concept map or something like that, then you are reconstructing the material, creating something new. And interactivity means you are constructing, but you're doing that in dialogue with peers or partners, right? So in dialogue with somebody else, at least one other person. So if we go to the next slide, we see that this is important because of what we view to be the cognitive and mental changes that happen in these different modes of learning, right? So in passive modes, all you're doing is storing information. And when it comes to what actually changes in your brain, all you do is you remember, right? So this is what in education we like to call you remember, and then you just reproduce. And the learning there is minimal. But as you go higher up the chain, you start to be able to apply your knowledge, you're able to transfer knowledge. And in interactive modes, and there's potential because you're discussing with your peers, you may have potential to create and form ideas and learn ideas that you never would have come up with on your own, right? So the gamut then for education, or the purpose then for education, let's push people to the right of this table, right? Can we have more active, more constructive, more interactive, and things which are more interactive, can we make better? Right? And this is important in the framework of Singapore education. If we go to the next slide, none of this is actually anything new, right? But what it means, as I was saying earlier, is that we want to push people to the right of the table. We want to take student content interaction here. So one of the main means in which we students learn, and we want to push that towards more active, more constructive rather than passive. And we want to create more interaction where that is possible. And in things which are already interactive, you want to support that interactive process to be better, right? None of these actually require really like high-tech technological solutions, but the place of digital learning is to give us more opportunities to do this, to be able to do this at greater scale, and perhaps implement certain things to one-up what we can do in analog, right? So we will see some examples in the next few slides, and we will take these ideas as a guide, right? So what we will do is we'll look at some of analog examples of things that we are doing now. We will see some established technologies that you can take and use immediately. And then we will see some things that researchers and startups are doing, right? Which may take a stronger feature in the future. And I'll post links in the chat so that you can actually see some of these in terms of YouTube video demos and all that yourselves as well. So if you go to the next slide. Right, okay. So this slide is on learning through role play and simulation, right? Something that we've been doing for a very long time. In educational psychology, we think about this in terms of the theory of grounded cognition or embodied cognition, right? And the idea is that sensory stimulation and use of your body and situated action is actually good and underlies cognition, and therefore good for utilizing them in learning activities is actually productive for learning. And the neural basis behind this, as we've heard from Ryu and Nastasia earlier, is that our higher order thinking and conceptual thinking often draws from inputs that come from our senses and from our motor actions, right? So engaging these senses and engaging our motor actions is argued to facilitate the activation and use of these higher order processes. I mean, from a very broad general sense of speaking, right? So this perspective would then, advocate, we want more role play, right? And this is not new in our schools. This is very old Straits Times article. I didn't realize how old it was, from 2012, about this secondary school teacher who taught the Japanese occupation in Singapore, right? But he turned his entire classroom for one lesson into a simulation of the Japanese occupation. So he came in as a Japanese sergeant, and the students had to be people living under the occupation. Right? But this is very hard to do. I mean, you can't do this all the time. It takes a lot of prep work. So how do we achieve this at bigger scale? Right? So one group that did this actually used this game called Second Life. Second Life is basically a video game which simulates life, right? Everything's the same. But they used it here so that students could role play the Mongkol Emperor in-game, so they could learn about the Mongkol Emperor. And so long as you have the hardware and software to run Second Life, you can conduct this, right? And they did a research study. So they compared people who just read about the Mongkol Emperor, read and had text, versus people who read the same text and had the role play. And people in the role play condition had a better memory of the history of the Mongke emperor. And when they asked them to read about this other person from the same time period and do a compare and contrast, the people in the role play condition also did better. Another similar study done by the same group, in fact, I think reported in the same paper, used Civilizations, the video game, right? So it's a $60 Sid Meier's Civilizations, if you've heard of it. And they got students to play this in their holiday, right? So they played this game in their holiday. And then when they came back to school, they learned about history. And the game doesn't have anything to do in particular with the curriculum and syllabus, and it didn't improve their education or their test scores immediately. But they found that it helped them learn more from the lesson, such that after the curriculum was covered, at the end, they actually learned more than the people who didn't play the video game during their holidays. So this is one way that we can promote active learning using education, right? Drawing on the same principle, if we go to the next slide, another example of more comes from science, which is lab experiments, right? So when we teach science in the classroom, we also have practicals so that students can see what's happening and develop knowledge of science through experimentation, right? But when we teach chemistry, we often do so at a very molecular level, right? So H2O or HCl and NaOH and very molecular, right? But when you do the practicals, it's always liquids and powders. So how do we help students relate the two, right? One way of doing that is through simulation. So technology has been applied, and we make simulations that help people see in the liquids and in the powders where are the molecules and what are they doing, right? So it helps students to be able to build this conceptual change and multiple representations that they can then sort of see the connection between what's happening in the lab and what's happening in the classroom. I can post the lab website for the simulation here. So this simulation is called PhET. They do many simulations in science. Maybe you can share with your colleagues if not you teach this, but you can see the idea applied also to economics, where you have a graph, and that graph is actually a separate representation from textual representation of the definition of a concept, right? So say demand and the demand curve, for example. But so can we see this to be more embodied, right? Taking the example of embodied cognition. So if you see the example on the bottom right, and I won't play the YouTube video now because we're short on time. They set up this big augmented reality setup, right? And instead of doing a simulation on a computer, you can stand in this artificial simulated beaker and you can control molecules using motion capture, right? So you use your hands motor function. And when they did this in a study, they actually had students, they had a 6-day lesson and they split it into half. Half the students did this simulation called Small Lab in the beginning. Half of them did it at the end, and they stopped and did it at the end. And the other sessions were used for regular classroom instruction. And the study found that actually in whichever group that learned the component with this sort of simulation in the augmented reality setting, they learned better than the regular classroom instruction, right? It didn't matter which group it was. They did better in the half where they learned using the simulation. So that's pretty strong evidence for the effectiveness of this sort of method of teaching. And if you'd like to see the YouTube video, that's here. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Okay, but probably better than active learning is constructive learning, right? If you follow the ICAP model. So you want to construct your own knowledge and reformulate what you learned in new forms, right? An age-old way of how we've taught students how to do this is mind maps, right? So we organize things from textbooks, things you learn in lectures, and put them in this concept map with related concepts. Current technology helps with this, right? So if you see at the top down here, this is draw.io. You can get it for free. You just Google it, draw.io. And you can even use it on your web browser now. I didn't know that. And it provides you tools to do concept mapping, right? So you can have an infinite canvas. You can have algorithms that arrange your boxes so that they're neater. You can have many colors without going to Popular and buying a 24 color pencil set or anything like that. And so that helps us to do concept mapping at larger scale and with less resources, right? But in research, some people have asked whether we can actually one-up this just mind mapping alone. And they do this by they merge the concept of mind mapping with another age-old educational wisdom, right, which is learning through teaching. So in the bottom right here, this is an old research application that does this. They actually have students make a concept map, and the concept map teaches this virtual computer student, right? And then the real students, can make their sort of taught students compete against one another in quiz shows. And when they did this and they compared it to a group which just did concept maps and then competed themselves in quiz shows, the ones who taught their virtual student actually performed better, right? Which actually finds some pretty strong evidence for this learning by teaching effect as well. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Right. Okay. So another way we can do constructive learning, right, is actually learning through assessment. This is something that is never new to us. We know that assessment is not just diagnostic, but also a learning event, right? That's why we have practice papers. That's why we send students home with homework, right? And it's arguably constructive because when you do practice, you don't actually like just regurgitate the knowledge unless it's specifically prepared for that particular question that came out, and then you can just revise the answer. Most of the time, you will actually need to reformulate what you know, what you learned in class, what you revised, what you learned probably in tuition class, to be able to apply it to this particular question that we know that you are supposed to answer now, right? When I was a history student, what my teacher always said, you must answer the question and be able to actually answer each specific question. It could be phrased differently. You have to reformulate what you know. But this is a very difficult thing to scale, right? Because good learning requires the practice to be at an appropriate level of difficulty. It should deliver good feedback, appropriate feedback, and needs to be adaptive, right? So when you have practice, you need to take information from the practice and then tweak the practice based on the diagnostic information you get. If not, students will either find it too difficult or too easy, right? And for teachers to be able to successfully do this, you need to mark, you need to understand what your marking is telling you about the students, and then you need to come up with new practice that targets the weaknesses that you have established, right? And in some ways, that current technology helps us deal with that is learning management systems, so like SLS, that help us to scale assignment implementation so you can push them online. You can summarize results from students to help you get a better sense of what's going on. And then we can potentially share practice resources between teachers and schools more easily, right? The tedious marking problem, MOE is also trying to solve using automated marking, right? So if we can find a way to mark things automatically, we can potentially automate some of this insight generation. And one of the leading text evaluation frameworks out there that tackles this problem is called Cometrics. So you can look that up if you're interested in this conversation. But how do we one up this, right? How do we one up automated marking and having test engines in learning management systems? By running this full loop between diagnosis and practice, diagnosis, adapting practice, right? So an exciting community that does this using AI models. So what they do is they take AI models and they model what the student knows, and what the student needs to know and what needs to be, and how do we teach those things, right? And it applies it in a technological system, which we call a set of technologies called intelligent tutoring systems, or more broadly, adaptive instructional systems, right? So they run this entire loop, and there's two main ways that they teach students. So one is called in-loop adaptivity, where when a student is attempting a particular task, you give them personalized feedback or hints based on what the computer thinks the student needs, right? And then there's also outer-loop adaptivity, that after they finish a particular practice question, what can the software then push them in order to help them? It's a new learning activity that's appropriate for their learning, right? So this actually does what I think Lloyd was talking about earlier. What does differentiated instruction look like in a technological sense, right? This is probably one of the stronger examples. So I don't really have time to play a video to give you an understanding of what inner and outer loop adaptivity look like. But here are a couple of resources, right? So there's a YouTube video here, which is a demonstration of one of these commercially available systems. It's one of the more polished ones that you have to pay money for. And so it's not free. But if you want to try your hand at some of these, there are some that you can try. Corbett is one of these systems that teaches data science and statistics. Ace Tutor does curricular stuff, and GIF does basically everything, right? But it was built by the US military, and so a lot of the applications are like sort of training soldiers to fight and shoot and things like that. Okay, but for now we will move on to the next slide, and this is the money shot in learning, right? So according to ICAP, the money shot in learning is interactivity. And I think by now, having been in COVID and all that, we know that there's no substitute for in-person. Right. So the goal of technology then is to increase the opportunities for high quality interaction digitally. So platforms like what we're doing now, Zoom, are able to do this, right? So if we couldn't meet in person, we can at least have a Zoom call. We can do things like breakout rooms. So if we couldn't have group discussions now, we can have breakout rooms so that you can have group discussions, and the teacher can even jump into individual breakout rooms to sort of play the facilitative role. So not different from going in between different groups of students. And we can also do things that support the in-person interactive experience, right? So discussion forums, chat windows, or things like MS Teams and Slack, that help to sort of extend the classroom discussion into an offline or online, from an offline setting into an online setting, right? And also serve as reference for students to go back to and reference during their discussions, and also for their own reference later on. And this draws on the idea of distributed cognition in psychology, right? That thinking does not happen just within us, as Natasha was saying earlier, that you have Google and the internet, and that changes our way that we retrieve information and we interact with, and our memory works, right? But in the distributed cognition view, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So Google and math calculators are not necessarily the devil. Computers do memory, they do search, they do like information storage better than us. And humans then can focus on things like forming these deep conceptual understandings, right? So definitely encourage everybody to use these very established tools already. But in research, people have thought, right? What are these tools enough? Can we do better at supporting collaborative learning? Right? And there's this entire field called CSCL, or Computer Supported Collaborative Learning, that studies what makes for effective technology to support collaboration and come up with tools that can support better collaboration. Right? So on the right, this is a screenshot from Knowledge Forum. It's a tool that actually Dr. Teo uses with another research group, and you can probably ask her more about later. And it's built to support knowledge building pedagogy, which Dr. Teo is an expert in, right? So this is a sort of pedagogy where students are organized as a community, and they are supposed to advance their collective knowledge as a community, right? So they can make posts, which are called notes, in these little squares, and these posts have multimedia support, right? So you can embed pictures, you can post links. You can also build on one another's posts, so you can reply to them and you can keep track of the conversation. So you see these blue arrows, you can see that this person replied to this person, and this person replied to this person, and these two people replied to this one person, right? And so you can follow the thread as a conversation. And this is something you can keep track of, and it's probably a better representation than other forums that do this, like Reddit. But it's not really anything that is super different, but there are some things about it which are super different, which is that you can actually reconstitute notes into different views, right? So this is one particular thread and a way of organizing the knowledge. But if you feel that you can reconstitute the knowledge in a different way, you can actually do that and create a new view that structures the knowledge in this way that you think it should be represented. And this encourages students to reconstitute the relations between nodes to synthesize their perspectives, right? And then you can also have discussions on this synthesizing perspectives. And then when you make a note, when you post a note, you're also supported by a bunch of scaffolds inside when you type out the note, right? And these encourage certain forms of thinking, including this sort of like meta discussions on, is your quality of discussion high? Is it going well? Is it productive? Right? So tools like Knowledge Forum are designed not just to support keeping track of a virtual conversation, as our forums and things like Reddit do, but it actually pushes students to think critically about the discourse, to improve it and to relate the discussions to form new perspectives. Right? So that's a very powerful way of using technology to enable better discussion in and beyond class. So on the next slide, that's been a whirlwind tour of a lot of things going on in educational technology. But I think the fundamental principle is let's not reinvent the wheel, right? We are still fundamentally human, social beings where learning often means making and applying meaning, right? And technology offers many, many possibilities, but often what's going to work best is things that we have already know are tried and true, like concepts and ideas that we already know tried and true, right? So some ideas from our tour include simulations, digital games and media that foster active engagement with the learning material, using technological tools that do things that are logistically difficult for us without them, right? So like making concept maps or doing presentations or automating marking and the insights that come from that, right? And then supporting interactivity, which the ICAP model says is the strongest form of education, right? There's no substitute for in-person for this, but technology can provide us virtual alternatives if we can't gather in person, and it can support the in-person discussions and extend them beyond our time where we can gather together, right? And then you can also push people in the best instances. We can push our students to use the discussion to think critically, to synthesize the information they're growing from the discussions, and we can improve the collaboration skills at a meta level, right? So those are some of the things that we can do with technology in education. Now, we go on the next slide. To round out the whole talk, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no escaping technology in modern society. Right? I don't think this is something I need to sell anybody on. And we know from real part of the talk that technology use will affect how we make and apply meaning and interact socially, right? And these are the fundamentals of human thinking, even at a neurological level, right? And this is not new, right? So as Ryu was sharing, Plato was saying that, oh, writing will change our thinking. And now we have the neural evidence with the visual work form area that can prove that, right? But none of us will go around quoting Plato and say, oh, writing changed our brains. This is bad. Literacy is bad. Let's just remember everything by heart, right? This is like what we should be doing. Nobody is actually going to say that now. But just as writing has changed the ancient mind, our technologies today are changing ours, right? So Nastasia shared about how social media taps on our own, the same tendencies we have as social beings in in-person interaction, and how our access and exercise of memory is being changed by technologies such as Google and Wikipedia, right? But is that necessarily a bad thing? Probably not, because the internet is not going anywhere, right? So what does that mean for us as educators? I think it means that it's not for us to improve our ability to act like computers, to store memory and retrieval, because we have computers that can do that for us now, right? But for us in education, our imperative is to improve our ability to learn and advance the conceptual understandings that we get from this information, right? So individually and as a group, as a community and as a society, right? And I spoke about a few ways that we can do this, right? We can immerse students in the material, we can get them to reconstruct it, we can provide them tailored practice, we can teach students to work collaboratively in a more productive, civil, and critical way, right? And we've been doing these things for years, but technology does make it easier and more scalable. Now, I suspect part of the reason why I wanted to have this talk is that there's this national zeitgeist of anxiety around technological disruption, right? Technology is now reshaping society several times within a generation, and this was something that used to take centuries. We are worried about how we and more importantly, our students and our children can adapt to each disruption, because we are, Singapore is a small island nation that is built on maintaining global relevance. So we are effectively forced to keep up with technology and do so constantly. But for all the technological changes that have occurred, right, from writing to radio, to telephones to TV, computers, internet, and the social media, from means of transportation like horses to information transfer at the speed of light with fiber optic, half the equation has always remained the same for us, right? People are still people, and we make and apply meaning in social communities. And I think for education, if you can teach people to do these things well, to be good people, I think we'll probably be fine with whatever comes next, right? So that's the end of the talk. And just a few words on us. So we are, again, from the Center of Lifelong Learning and Individualized Cognition. It's a collaboration between Cambridge University and NTU. And we study cognitive flexibility across the lifespan. But our group in particular focuses on schools, right? And if you're interested in some of what we do, some of our principal investigators, the sort of like heads of the project, have written an article on this. You can find it in the Straits Times, but it's subscriber only. So if you're not a subscriber to the Straits Times, you can also see the same article in the conversation, right? Yes, and that's the end of our talk. Thank you very much.